We're so excited. Dr. McFarland is here. I'm going to read a little introduction and then we will turn it over to Dr. McFarland. So, welcome to Florida State University's webinar series called Art Education in Critical Times, or what we've been calling ACT for short. I'll be introducing our webinar series presenter in just a moment. In the meantime, my name is Amber Ward. I'm the Director of Online Programming in the Department of Art Education at FSU. And this professional development outreach is sponsored by our online MS in Art Education program. We are excited that we've had friends of FSU presenting, alumni. In the case of Annie, she's both students, former students, and so on. Like I've mentioned, today's presenter is Dr. Annie McFarland. Dr. McFarland is a board-certified registered art therapist and art educator originally from Farmington Hills, Michigan. She earned an MS and a PhD in art therapy from FSU. Her dissertation research focused on the use of papermaking with veterans to address trauma, PTSD, and veteran to civilian readjustment. As an assistant professor of art education and visual arts therapy at West Virginia University, Dr. McFarland has continued her research on papermaking in art therapy, teaching art education and therapeutic art coursework, and developing art therapy programming at WVU. Dr. McFarland has worked in a variety of settings, including hospice care, inpatient psychiatric facilities, pediatric rehabilitation, memory care and dementia facilities, and various veteran settings. In addition to her clinical work, she has done research and training in art education and worked with art educators to help develop therapeutic art education approaches and culturally responsive teaching practices. So tonight's presentation will last about an hour. Annie might invite you to do this, but I will as well. Feel free to grab materials so that you can work alongside her. All attendees have been muted, so to reduce the ambient noise of the Zoom recording. However, there will be an opportunity for Q&A toward the end and perhaps throughout. You can submit any questions you might have for her using the chat function located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And in the coming days, we will email you a PD certification, and Annie has already forwarded some really fantastic resources that we've uploaded to the ACT open source repository. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Annie McFarland, who will be talking about self-care in the time of COVID. Thanks so much for joining us, Annie.
Hi everyone. I am so excited to be here. Yeah, there's so much I want to say, but I'll just kind of jump into the presentation here too. So the way that I do presentations, I usually ask questions. So if you want to use the chat to respond, or I think you should be able to unmute yourself if there's anything you want to say or kind of jump in. There's some parts in the lecture too that'll have that. And then I also use this program called Mentimeter, which is all you do is go to this website, menti.com, and I'll put that on the screen when we get to that point. But it's like a live polling feature. So you do polls and then it makes a visual in real time. So that's kind of cool too. So there's a few different ways you can respond, but however you want, chat or responding works. So let me make sure I got about 4 different windows open. So okay, so jumping into our self-care, right? So I was telling a coworker about this presentation today, and I thought, oh man, I'm talking about self-care, but I haven't really been doing a good job of practicing self-care. So it's a good reminder for me to present and also practice myself too. So I'll be doing these things along right there with you too. So just an outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I like to sandwich it with an art making experience on the front end and the end as well too. So we'll start by doing a self-care check-in. We'll talk about stress and burnout, what that means. We'll talk a little bit about what exactly self-care is, some simple strategies for self-care, and also about flow experiences. So you may have studied that or heard about that as well too, but art is a great way to kind of encourage and engage in those flow activities. And then we'll end with a really short art activity that I'll introduce to you that's super simple, but it's really effective too. So okay, so the first thing we're going to do, and all you'll need really, if you have like notebook paper or scrap paper, anything you can draw on, and a pen will work too. Of course, if you want to use color, you can as well. But this is really an activity that I've used this semester with a lot of my students as well, in kind of doing this self check-in for ourselves, right? So the idea of self-care is there's a lot of self-care inventories, and we'll talk about those in a minute too. But they have lists of things. I like to do this because it's dictated by what you're doing and more about you. Instead of filling out someone else's list, you're kind of checking in with yourself on your own terms, right? So what you'll do with this activity, and I'm going to show you an example after this too, is make a list of the things that you do on an average week. So it could be really general, like work, sleep, home, whatever, all those things, driving, if that's a part for you as well. And then once you have this list, you'll go through and rank the items. So whichever one you spend the most time doing, mark that one and kind of go through and kind of rate them. And the idea is to make this visual pie chart here with your top activities, or even you can use your entire list and look at visually how much time am I spending doing each of these things. And then after you've created that, you can kind of look at it and check in with yourself. Is there anything missing in my week that I wish was there? Or is there something I'd like to add? What am I doing really well? So this is an easy way to kind of do a visual check-in. And I wanted to share with you one that I did for myself, and it'll make a little more sense too. So what I did was I went through and kind of just free association, wrote all of the things that on the average week that I do. So I have all these different things that I do during my week. And I went through and rated them. So you can do a number, or you can highlight them different colors, whatever you want. So once you kind of go through and figure out, think about what activities am I doing the most, making a pie chart, right? And color coding it too. So all these things here, and if you're a numbers person, you can think about it in percentages. I am not a numbers person. So I just think about how much of my pie is what's going to be the biggest piece. So looking at this, I kind of reflected on what my week was like. And then I thought, is there something that's missing in there? And the two things that really stuck out for me the most were exercise, movement is not incorporated in there. And also making art was not in there. So for me, that was kind of like, oh, sad, because I didn't make time for myself to make art too. So that was kind of a check-in for me. So that's just an example of one way you can do it. Some people use it and do, bar graph or different visualizations too. But the idea is to combine a written list and create a visual form. Yeah, so we'll start out doing that. So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that as well. Any questions about this before we jump into that? No? Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes here, maybe like 5 minutes, just to kind of jot some things down and kind of reflect on those questions as well. Okay. So I know it's not a lot of time to get to do this activity, but just kind of looking at your list. And if you started to do your visual component as well too, just to get some feedback, what were some of the things that you find were the most prevalent in your week? What are the things you're doing the most in your week? And if you want to use the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and talk, you can do that as well. All right, Audrey said academic and school related things, right? So definitely work, right? School is for sure work too, so absolutely. Anyone else find that that was kind of their primary chunk of time?
Yes, I agree with Audrey. I also, my top 3 things were teach art, prep for lessons, and lesson plan. So those are definitely the majority of my time as well. Not that I'm complaining, but
Yeah, and that's the whole thing too with this kind of these check-ins too, is just to observe and really do just that, a check-in. You know, it's not to feel guilty that you're not doing something or you should be doing something too, but it's really a good, I think the visual and the written together is great because it really gives you more of that, for us visual learners, that picture of how much we're doing and maybe some areas that you want to add in. So what about was there anything that you wish there was more of or that was missing from your week? Procrastination was missing. Oh, that's awesome. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to figure that out as well. Does that mean that you're not procrastinating, Stevie?
And honest, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So Allison said more exercise, art, reading. Yeah. So all of those things too, that you listed there, Allison, too, are all self-care things, right? So those things that we wish that we could do more. Yeah, so procrastinate, I love that too. That's such a great word too. Excellent. Yeah, so this is just kind of this visual check-in for you too. So if you go on the internet and you search for self-care inventory or assessment, things like that, what you'll find are a lot of really great free resources. Okay, let me skip through this. All right. So one example that I really like too that is included in your resources is the NAMI self-care inventory. And it really covers a lot of different areas. So there's lots of different activities in these different sections. So they talk about the 5 core components of self-care being physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and then that work professional too. So there's all these different areas where we should be taking care of ourselves, or that we ideally we should be taking care of ourselves in all these different ways. These can be helpful, but they can also be problematic. So when I say problematic, why, if just looking at some of these questions, do you think this might be problematic in some ways? So for example, with the physical self-care, right? There's some things in there too, getting regular medical care for prevention, right? Or medical care when necessary too, taking time off when sick, right? If you can afford to do those things, then that's great. But if you don't have health insurance, or you don't have the luxury of being able to take time off of work too, that is an issue too. So these self-care inventories are very generalized, and I think kind of call for an update really of talking about more diverse people taking these inventories as well too. The other thing too to mention when you have lists like this too is a lot of times people will go through this list and think, well, I don't do that, but should I be doing that? So then it kind of provokes these feelings of guilt, right? Like, oh, if it's on the list, I should be doing that, right? So I always encourage people, if you do use one of these inventories like this, If there's something that you don't agree with or that's not important to you, then just cross it off. Don't even answer it too. So the whole point of doing the visual check-in that we started with too was kind of to do like a custom tailored towards your own personal interests too. So yeah, so I'll include, there's this one, and then there's another inventory too that I found to be kind of helpful as well too. So you'll have those resources, but keeping in mind really that it's super important for you to think about what's best for you when it comes to self-care. And it only has to make sense to you. That's the beautiful part about it too. Okay. So thinking about stress too, one of the things that is just so much fun to talk about, right? I know being the end of the semester, we're all feeling it as well too. So what exactly is stress? So stress is actually a normal reaction in our body. So when we encounter some kind of stimuli, right? So these stressors can come from our environment, whether it be home, workplace, wherever you are. They can come from your body, physical sensations of stress. The way that we kind of hold our shoulders, you know, everyone's used to typing and sitting at computers. So a lot of people scrunch up. That's kind of our natural form now. And then also your thoughts too, right? Anxiety can stress us out as well too. So lots of different ways that that it is can affect us, right? That's an important thing here too, is the stress is not just in your mind too, it's a physiological response too. So it's something that happens in our body, whether it's a positive stressor or a negative stressor as well. So if you want to use the Zoom chat, what are some of your current stressors, right? So some of the things that you're kind of stressed out about.
Getting grades in by the end of the semester, kind of like the workload and just balancing everything.
The deadlines. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Another thing too, that this kind of falls in our timeline too of where we're doing this activity is the holidays. Sometimes that can be fun, but that can also be really stressful too. Shane said employment and relocation. Oh man, yeah. Moving, oh boy, is a stressful thing. COVID, yes, Stephen, yes, COVID too. We're going to talk about that as well too. So yeah, there's lots of things kind of floating around that we are holding on to. Yeah, the holidays, the weather, Nicole, you're right, absolutely, yeah. So lots of different things. I know if we came up with a master list, it could probably be like 4 pages long of all these things that we're all thinking about and dealing with, right? Yeah, so lots of stressors. So when we think about stress too, thinking about different levels of stress, right? So we have positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. So this kind of continuum here is going to look different for every person. And I teach a lot about how stress impacts development in children. So this graphic is from a presentation on adverse childhood experiences, but I find that this is really relevant to adults as well too, right? So so thinking about positive stressors, things that we can bounce back from pretty easily. Tolerable stressors may be something that's a little bit more serious, but we have these positive relationships. We have these coping skills that help us to bounce back. And then toxic stress is when we have kind of that recurring, prolonged stressors and not a lot of coping skills or ability to deal with those stressors too. So again, thinking about getting a shot, right? The COVID shot, if you did that too, like for some people that was no big deal. For other people, it was like getting a shot is like the worst thing on the planet, right? Same thing with public speaking. That might be scary to some people, but might be okay with other people too. So kind of thinking about your stress level, again, thinking about what relates to you and it resonates with you is what's really important in this concept. And so I was thinking too about, since this presentation too is about self-care in the time of COVID, how really has COVID impacted us in these different levels of stress too? And some of the things I was thinking about were our stress itself, right? We have even more stressors added on. So COVID and our safety, you know, our human safety and our friends and our family and all of those things too. Our environments have totally changed, right? So the way we're working is different. When we're around other people, we have to be very careful. When we're going out places, things like that. And also to relationships. And I mention this too, because one thing that helps alleviate stress are nurturing, stable, engaging environments and those important relationships. And COVID really has isolated us too. So it's changed the way those relationships function and the way that we interact with people. Much more phone calls, FaceTime, Zoom calls, things like that as well too. So COVID has really changed the way that we function and also the way that we look at our stressors as well too. So just really some things to think about there. So when we think about prolonged stress, we often come up with this word burnout too. So if you're in education, which I know most of you are, or if you're in counseling, or any of these helping professions where you're helping someone else, you're serving other people or students, more susceptible for this level of burnout. So this is just this constant state of mental or physical exhaustion caused by these repeated stressors without resolution, right? So you can become really exhausted mentally and physically, becomes more cynical, and also too kind of an overall level of ineffectiveness too. One thing that happens to me when I start getting burnout too is I start to miss appointments. I forget about things and I know, okay, that's not like me, but when that happens, I know, okay, I need to do some self-care and kind of check in with myself as well. So some potential impacts of burnout too. So again, just like stress is physiological, burnout can be physiological too, right? So there can be physical symptoms. You're changing your perception, right? So you're not motivated to do things, or you're maybe more critical of others or yourself. Just this kind of level of exhaustion, just all around. Maybe more irritability, and also too, when you're stressed, higher stress levels, your immune system actually decreases. I think that's the right word. I never can remember the correct terminology, but you can get sick more because your immune system is like totally burnout as well, right? So lots of different ways that burnout can affect us too. So if you start recognizing some of these symptoms, that's a time when you can kind of check in with yourself as well. So checking in with ourselves and thinking about like the battery, right? Thinking of ourselves as having this battery. How much are we charged, right? So when our battery in the cell phone goes out, when we see that red, the battery lightning bolt of death, with we got to plug that phone back in. So we need to make sure that we're treating ourselves in the same way too. So kind of checking in with you as well too. This is a really cool program that Mentimeter program. So what you'll do kind of to just check in with you guys is what is your current battery level? So if you go to menti.com and let me just, I can never figure out how to get out of my presentation without stopping sharing. Let me just go and give you this again. So yeah, so you'll go to menti.com and it'll ask you for this little code. And so then once you put the code in, it'll take you to a survey. And so it'll be a live action survey. So what I'll do here too is put this in the chat as well. And then 21951817. And then you'll just type that code in, then you can answer the question. All right, so I'm going to share that screen so we can see the live action. Okay. I can change this as well too, so. All right, so we got some feeling good, so we got some feeling okay, we got some struggling. Yeah. So it looks like, yeah, we have kind of a mixture as well too. So yeah, so kind of thinking of ourselves as this battery check, right? Thinking about what is my energy level and how much do I have? Ooh, another struggling. Yeah, I'm right there with you too. How much do you have to give, right? So if your battery's low, you can't really give much out or give to yourself either, right? So Those caretaking professions, that's really, really hard, is when you're expected to take care of other people too. Your battery gets depleted, right? Yeah, absolutely too. All right, feeling okay. We got another one. Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. Alice, just feeling okay. Optimism, yes. Positivity, yep. Yeah, and you might, tomorrow might be different too. So kind of checking in with yourself on a daily basis. That's important as well too. Great. But I like using that Mentimeter as well too, because I think that's a tool that not a lot of educators know about, and it's really cool. It's free too. So you can do word clouds too. That's always really cool as well. Yeah. Okay, so jumping back to our battery here. Okay, so one of the reasons I talk about checking in too, and I know I'm talking with mostly educators as well too. So thinking about how you want to feel and how you actually feel, right? So this was a survey done before the pandemic. What are the 3 most emotions you feel during the workday by teachers who were surveyed? They said anxious, fearful, worried, overwhelmed, and sad. And they wanted to feel happy, inspired, valued, supported, effective, and respected, right? So a lot of stress at the beginning of COVID too, and I'm sure that this has increased as well too. So I need to find out if they did a follow-up survey to this, because I feel like we could probably add some more words onto both of those lists as well too. Maybe even safe, right? Safety might be mentioned, how you want to feel in the classroom as well. So this idea of compassion fatigue too. So if you've heard that term before, sometimes is synonymous with secondary traumatic stress disorder. So you can become overwhelmed from giving to other people, and also too, if you're working, especially I found working in trauma and working with people who are in crisis too, that energy can impact you as well too. So being influenced by other people's energy, and also how much energy you're putting out and not receiving back, right? So this idea that you can't pour from an empty cup, you need to be able to refill yourself too. So that feeling of exhaustion too, that's a big component of it as well. Yeah. So a lot of this has to do with just outside of our work, but just in our society too, the pressures of American culture, right? So everything is fine. I'm fine. Someone asked you, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. It's fine. So this kid wrote, every one of them says, how are you? And you always have to say good, even if you're not good. That's kind of our nature, is just to be like, oh, everything's great. How are you doing? Very conversational. But the reality is that we experience different range of emotions every single day, right? So you might feel all 6 of these core emotions in one day. You might feel 2 of them, right? So it's very dependent on the day, and thinking about fluctuations is normal, right? But you don't have to be good all the time. Sometimes you can be not good, and that's totally fine as well too. Another thing, and these are all observations that I've noticed too, just from working in therapy and working in schools and things too. But we have a lot of pressure that we put on students and on ourselves to do your best, high performance, assessments, things like that, being productive, right? Delivering more than is expected, right? So we always have this urge in our society to kind of keep pushing and to keep improving too. If you go to the bookstore, you'll see the self-help section is always huge, right? All these ways to improve ourselves. So even if you're taking time to read, you might get a self-help book where you're working on improving that too, right? So that's kind of the nature of our culture and our society as well. The reality is that we need rest and we need downtime, right? So even though the battery analogy is helpful, we're more than just machines, right? Your best is going to look different every single day, and that's okay. Sometimes you have to say, I'm giving 50% today because that's all I have today to give left. I love this analogy here about the Starship Enterprise from Star Trek too. It could run at full speed all the time, but if it did, then his engines would explode and kill everyone, right? So that's more of an extreme example, but you don't have to be running full speed all the time, right? You can take breaks, and you shouldn't feel guilty for taking rest and taking breaks as well too. Rest can look like different things. It's not necessarily just a nap, right? Maybe going outside, getting away from people, right? If you're overstimulated by people asking you for things. I kind of had that thought this morning on my way to work. Like, today's one of those days where like 7 people asked me for something and I just have to give to other people. If you teach or you have clients, right? Nicole, you might have your art therapy clients too. Like, they need you, right? Your students need you. So you have to do that, right? But taking time away where you're not having these responsibilities. And I love this too, being unproductive, right? That's also super important as well too. So sometimes choosing not to do anything is a valid form of self-care, to give yourself a break too. Being unproductive can be a great thing too. That's why I laughed too, Stephen, when you said procrastination too, because sometimes we need to procrastinate, right? I wouldn't encourage it all the time, but sometimes you need that time off and that, I'm going to do it later and kind of take a break as well too. I also like this analogy here too about we're all like gardens, right? We need different things at different times. What do we need to grow? What do we need to flourish and to be healthy too? So thinking about what does my garden need today too? And that's a good way to kind of check in with ourselves as well. So in American culture too, we talk about self-care as like the buzzword now, self-care and resiliency, right? Really thinking about like treat yourself, right? I love that episode of Parks and Rec, it's great. But we kind of have like this glossed over perception of what self-care really is, right? It's going to the spa, it's getting a massage, it's doing these things. Those can all be restorative things. But they can be so much more than that too. And really, it's all about figuring out what is right for you. I always include this good vibes only shirt too, because I feel like I want to make one that looks like this, but says all vibes only. So, gotta honor like everyone's vibes are different. It's okay to be not good sometimes too. So, and I also to include this always smile, be happy. When I worked in inpatient psych, there was one nurse that would always write this on the patient's boards. And so we were dealing with people in very, very severe crises. So if they would come out of their room, they'd see on the wall, always smile, always be happy, right? And like, if you knew what I was going through, I think that would not be possible, right? So it's in some ways too, it's hard when you're going through some things too. It's nice to, have some kind of reassurance that, yeah, like what you're going through is tough. You don't have to be happy too. So I like to tell stories in my presentations as well. So lots of good stuff in the chat too, right? Ooh, yeah. So Stephen, you're right. Like opportunity for other people to kind of judge like your productivity. And that happens so much in work and professions and school too. We always compare ourselves to other people too, and them to us too. So that's really, really tough too. Yeah. So self-care is really anything that you do to take care of your emotional, physical, or mental, spiritual health as well. So it's taking care of you, making sure that you're taking care of you. You can't take care of others unless you take care of yourself. So for many of us that are caretakers, this can be really challenging because spending time on ourselves can feel selfish, but really, it's important to nourish ourselves and to recharge that battery, right? So what can we do to recharge ourselves? An art therapist I worked with, Denise Wolf, she came up with this triangle form here, the sustainable habits of mind of self-care. So these are the things that she recommends people do in their lives to make sure that they recharge and kind of implement these strategies for recharging. So doing something every day that relaxes you, one thing each week that juices you, right? Something that gets you excited, gets you pumped up. Each month have one day of no responsibility. Every quarter, a day off, if you can do that. Sometimes even once off in a quarter is stretching it, and then also have some kind of vacation or holiday planned every year too. And not necessarily, like, oh, I'm going to Hawaii this year, like it could be a staycation. It could be something that, you don't spend any money, but it's just spending time just for you and setting that time aside too. So all of these things really are about knowing who you are, knowing your limits. So when you've had too much, when you're stressed, knowing when you need to rest and what that looks like. Making sure you're well fed, so not just food and what we're putting into our bodies, but into our brain, kinds of things we're watching as well. And taking time to really love ourselves and to decompress every day, right? So finding those small things that we can do that really are easy to implement. So we'll talk about that when we get to the art making here in a bit. But just some ways and suggestions for self-care, right? So Zoom fatigue is definitely a real thing. I know we're on Zoom right now. I think it's more out of necessity, but really kind of unplugging from technology, whether that's phone, computer, sometimes our TV, right? We stream stuff from the internet from our TVs now too. But unplugging really helps us to promote mindfulness. Looking at your phones at night, it impacts sleep and your sleep quality too. I'm so guilty of playing games on my phone in bed, so I cannot preach that. But and also to kind of disconnecting from technology and reconnecting with those connections in person, right? So that's kind of something we're slowly adding into as we kind of work through the COVID times too, is that personal connection and safety as well too. And all of this can really help with our productivity and learning in the end. When you're more rested, more recharged, you're able to handle more, you're able to take it in more as well too. Another thing that can help with self-care and de-stressing too is getting into nature. So there was a study done that looked through, I think I read this on the Smithsonian website, but a study looked at the health benefits of being out in nature, and they found that natural sounds in the natural parks, bird sounds were helpful for alleviating stress, water sounds boosted overall health, and positive emotions like tranquility too. And there were some physical outcomes that were really improved as well too. Yeah. And so then we start talking too about flow too. So you may have heard of this term before, or this concept, but this idea of where you're completely immersed in an activity. So one of the things I learned from my PhD work with Dr. Pat Villeneuve at FSU was how to pronounce this guy's name, because she made us practice it. And his name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So don't ask me how I remembered that somehow, but he actually passed away recently, but he was a prolific influence in this psychology of flow. He came up with this concept too. So it's really those times where you're just like totally into an activity and time passes. Before you know it, it's been 3 hours, you know? So these kinds of experiences where you're challenged just enough and it requires just enough mindfulness and focus that you can't really think about anything else. So in this way, it kind of is like giving our brains a break as well too. Another thing too that I like to mention too is an art therapy study in 2016 that looked at the therapeutic benefits of art making, right? So these researchers from Drexel studied 35 people, and they actually measured their saliva levels before and after participating in one of these 3 art activities here. And so cortisol is the hormone, it's literally the stress hormone. So the more stressed you are, the more cortisol you have in your saliva. So that's an indicator of your stress level. So it was open studio, just come in, make whatever you want, choose whatever you want, and no expectation to create anything. It's just come in and play, basically. So after they measured people's saliva, what they found was every participant, no matter what the activity was, demonstrated a reduction in cortisol levels. So this is a biological indicator that art making helps us with relieving stress, right? And one of the parameters too, I think that's really important with this study is that there was no expectation of an outcome, and it was just open studio free choice. So that allowed a sense of control as well. So when they looked at the responses of the participants, they found participants said that their responses, or the result of participating in art, was feeling more relaxed, feeling enjoyment, learning about themselves in a new way, feeling a sense of flow or losing themselves in the work, feeling free from constraints, and experiencing an evolving process of change, right? So not knowing what to do at the beginning and then kind of working through that and creating and making something at the end as well. And really people wanted to continue creating art too. So if you're looking for kind of some evidence of the benefits of art making for health and wellness, this is a great article to look at as well. And Amber, I don't think that I put this in the folder, but I meant to send this. So I will send this to you as soon as we're done here too as well. So things that we can do, art activities too. So if you're in fine arts, we kind of get used to looking at, these fine art materials and really high quality things. But thinking about what activities you could just sit down and do as a kid is really a great way to kind of tap into these flow experiences. So whether it's just scribbling, coloring, coloring books for adults are a big thing now too. So shrinky dinks, I love doing the perler beads where you like iron the little plastic beads and make little weird shapes and stuff. I always ended up making Mario stuff somehow. But yeah, so these activities that you really kind of just got into as a kid, and the things that you really enjoyed. So kind of reconnecting with that as an adult too. So yeah. I'm trying to keep up with the chat too. I get overwhelmed with lots of information at the same time. But yeah. So it's like we know as artists that art works, right? We go to it for all sorts of reasons, for self-expression, for all these different things. But this is kind of like the science proof, like here's why and here's how, So that's what's cool about art therapy too, is it's like it validates a lot of what we know as artists and fine artists too, and what we're experiencing as well too. So some of my suggestions too for creating these flow experiences through art making. So thinking about the experience from that article too, a lot of this is what they were doing in these open studio approaches, right? So focusing on the process of creating, not thinking about what is it going to look like, what is it, the outcome, really playing and getting back to the things that you used to like to do, not worrying about if it looks good or bad, kind of eliminating those things. So really embracing this idea of mindfulness and kind of observing what we're feeling and not judging it in any way. And again, you can use super cheap materials too, and short amounts of time, right? So these easily accessible materials, things that you have around, especially if you're in the classroom or you're in an office too, these might be things that you have around you already anyway too. So you don't have to have like the, 120 Crayola set, to be successfully implementing these things. If you have one pencil and a Post-it note set, you can do that too. So really kind of just embracing the process too. So what I wanted to do was look at an activity that I've used, and we've got about 10 minutes, so this is perfect, with mandalas too. So in art therapy, we frequently use mandalas. And so people think of these like super complex geometric designs. That's not what we're doing with this. You can do that if that's what you're into and that's what you feel like doing. But really, this idea is just drawing within a circle, right? So I love using Post-it notes are a perfect size for this. So if you want to use that, an index card, if you have a receipt, you can use that, an envelope, right? You might have some junk mail around, or even just your sketchbook too. And so the idea with this activity is use whatever you have accessible to you, and then keeping it small too. So working smaller and shorter amount of time, I think we'll talk a little bit about what that experience does when we make art as well. But really focusing on mindfulness and art making without that good or bad component too. So what you'll do is you can either trace something. I'll stop sharing just for a second. You can trace something you have that's circular, or if you want to freehand anything, coffee mugs work great, soda can works great, or if you're like, I'm ready to just freehand a circle, you can do that. And all you're going to do I'll just show you an example. And this is a really, oh, I'm not supposed to say it's a bad circle, but it is a bad circle. But just start with that. And then all you're going to do is just fill it in with lines, with color. And the idea is not, it doesn't have to be representational. It can be totally abstract, whatever you want to do. And so just fill in that circle, and we'll do that for about 10 minutes. There's no right or wrong way to do that. And I'll play some music this time too, so we have some kind of relaxing music, but I'll let you know when maybe we'll do this just for about 5 minutes, I think, because I don't want to take up too much of the time and have room for questions as well. So. work for about maybe 2 more minutes. Okay. Normally I would have more time, but I don't want to keep us too long. But just kind of come into a place where you're able to close from that activity, or kind of tie up loose ends, things like that. What are your responses or your reactions to that activity? And you can use the chat, or you can unmute yourself as well too.
Hey everybody. I actually just had an emotional response, and it came out of nowhere. I grabbed my phone and I just did a screenshot of my home screen, and I was able to write on it. So I did, this circle, and I started to write words in it. Then the circle started to get filled with words that were just spontaneously coming out of me. And then I did spirals on top of those words, and then wrote more words. And then I started to feel peace, and I wrote the word peace. And then a tear fell out of my eye. I was like, well, what's going on? So when you don't realize that you're not okay, and then you're starting to become okay, like that journey just came back to me just in this moment. So yeah, that's what I just experienced.
Stevie, you're gonna make me cry. That's awesome. I mean, not awesome that you cried, but it's good that you were able to kind of tap into that. And it just starts from drawing within a circle, right? And kind of letting ourselves go into that space. And also too, you brought up a really good point that sometimes it's words we need too, right? That's it. It can be forms, but it can also be words too.
Hi, this is Sherry. And I find it really important. Art is always there for us. It's a meditation waiting to happen in our lives. And I'll never get over how amazing art can transform lives. And just in this little experience, so often I can tell myself, you're too busy. You can't just sit down and do some clay for 5 minutes, or, and then I realize I really want to do it longer, so this is a great experiment to add to this presentation, to really just connect and know that gift is always out there for all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so one of the reasons that it's that 10 minutes too is because that's just enough to kind of get us sucked in there, right? But having those shorter times like that too, it kind of eliminates, well, for some of us, takes out that part where we're judging and thinking about the product, right? If you know that you only have just this small amount of time, you don't really have time to overthink it too. So kind of going into it with that mindset too. I think, Sherry, you used the word meditation too, kind of using this as that check-in and as a way to kind of practice that mindfulness, that short time, and then really open to whatever it is that you feel called to do, so kind of tapping into that as well too. Yeah. Excellent. Such good feedback. Wow. Anyone else have anything, any kind of response or reaction? We can also open it up to questions too. If you have any questions about anything that we talked about tonight. Sometimes I feel like an hour is not enough time,
Well, I just want to say really quick that I almost didn't know if I was going to be able to make it tonight just because I've had so much going on and a lot on my plate. And I'm just so thankful that I did and that I decided to just hop on anyway, because it felt really much needed. And it felt like you were saying things that I needed to hear, like that I know, like, okay, yes, you're getting burnt out. You need to take care of yourself. But I haven't been doing, like you said, I've been talking to my students about, self-care and mental health, but maybe haven't been practicing what I preach as much as I should be. And so I felt really glad and almost a little rejuvenated now after this. And like, I have some ideas for things to take with me into the classroom. And also, just one thing I wanted to say is how you were mentioning like Zoom fatigue and how it's definitely important to get unplugged. But I just wanted to add that I am very thankful to Zoom for allowing me to join in on things like that. That otherwise, like if this was at person at FSU tonight or something, I wouldn't have been able to make it. I just I had to do things. I had to come home and feed my cats and make dinner. And so being able to hop in on Zoom and have my notebook and follow along and get ideas was just really, really wonderful. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Absolutely. A lot of the hardest part is showing up and participating, too. That takes a lot of, and the self-care is like such a nebulous term too, right? Like we don't really take the time to define, like, we know we need to take care of ourselves, but what does that really mean, right? And it can be so different for each of us too. There was a picture I almost included in this too, that there's a lot of artists I follow on Instagram that have kind of like self-help kind of things too. And one of them was a drawing of a picture of a person doing a handstand. And it said, you don't have to understand, I'm practicing self-care. Like to someone else, it might look really weird, but to you, if it's rejuvenating and it's restorative, then that's what really, really matters too. So, yeah. Another thing too, I was going to mention, have become such a fan of the Post-it notes too, because if you're using like an agenda planner for work too, it makes it such a nice place to like ambush your agenda and to-do list with art, like random acts of art. You can do it and stick it in there, so really making that time and the accessibility component of that, I think is important too. So yeah. Excellent. Oh my gosh, such good responses too. I wanted to also put in my email address as well. So I do lots of presentations too about, self-care obviously, but a lot about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed teaching, social and emotional learning. And a lot of those things are components that revolve around emotion regulation and awareness as well too. So whether it's in the classroom or creating art activities that kind of help promote those things too. If you have any questions or you want to like talk about some ideas, I'm totally available to do that. And so my email address is there as well too. So if you ever want to reach out and chat about things too. So.